Her words fell like stones into still water. The mountain's daughter stood beyond iron bars, repeating her father's poison, while the caged mountain man turned his scarred face toward shadows that offered no comfort. In this dusty frontier town, where judgment came swift as desert wind, a man's past could cage him tighter than any cell. The space between them held all the cruelty of civilized folk toward those who'd lived too long in wild places. Subscribe to witness a story where hearts break not from bullets, but from the simple, devastating truth that some wounds never heal. They only learn to hide. The jail cell smelled of rust and regret, its iron bars casting long shadows across the wooden floor like prison stripes that would never fade. Outside, the desert town of Bitter Creek continued its slow dance with the dying afternoon sun. But inside these walls, time had stopped the moment she spoke those words. The mountain man sat on his narrow cot, broad shoulders hunched forward, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white as old bone. Her voice still echoed in the cramped space, young, clear, and sharp enough to cut through years of carefully built defenses. He had faced down grizzly bears and survived winters that killed lesser men, but nothing had prepared him for the casual cruelty of a 16-year-old girl delivering her father's verdict. The silence that followed her words was heavier than the chains they'd used to bring him down from his mountain cave. She stood there still, just beyond his reach, her calico dress pristine against the dusty backdrop of the sheriff's office. The mountain's daughter. That's what the townspeople called her, though her name was Sarah, and she'd never climbed higher than the church bell tower. Her father owned half the businesses on Main Street and all of the opinions that mattered in Bitter Creek. She had inherited his sharp tongue and his certainty that the world could be divided into decent folk and dangerous ones. The way she looked at him now, with a mixture of fascination and disgust, reminded him of how people stared at caged animals in traveling shows. Her blue eyes held no malice, which somehow made her words cut deeper. She was simply repeating what she'd been taught, the way children recite prayers without understanding the weight of what they're asking for. The mountain man had been living alone in the high country for 7 years, ever since the incident that drove him from civilization. Up there, among the pine trees and granite peaks, he'd found a kind of peace that didn't require explanations or apologies. The animals didn't care about his past, and the mountains didn't judge the scars on his hands or the haunted look that never quite left his eyes. He'd built a cabin with his own hands, learned to read the weather in cloud formations, and discovered that solitude could be a blessing rather than a punishment. But now, dragged down to face charges he couldn't deny, he felt the weight of those 7 years pressing against his chest like a stone. The wild places that had healed him seemed impossibly far away, separated by more than just miles and iron bars. Her father, Judge Morrison, had been the one to sign the warrant that brought him down from his mountain refuge. The charges were old but serious: assault, destruction of property, disturbing the peace, stemming from a night when grief and whiskey had turned him into something he barely recognized. He'd never denied what he'd done, had simply chosen exile over explanation, believing that distance could somehow erase the damage. But the law had a longer memory than he'd hoped, and Judge Morrison had a reputation for believing that justice delayed was justice denied. The irony wasn't lost on him that the man who'd condemned him as a beast had raised a daughter who could deliver that judgment with such innocent precision. She was her father's child in every way that mattered, shaped by his certainties and protected by his position. The afternoon light slanted through the single-barred window, painting golden rectangles on the opposite wall that reminded him of the way sunlight used to filter through the canopy of his mountain home. Up there, he'd watched seasons change with the patience of someone who had nowhere else to be and nothing left to prove. He'd grown his own food, mended his own clothes, and slowly rebuilt something that might have been called peace if he'd been brave enough to name it. The townspeople below had become stories he told himself on long winter nights, distant figures moving through a world he'd chosen to leave behind. But stories had a way of becoming real again when you least expected it, and now he was trapped in one that had no clear ending. Sarah shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her boots making small sounds against the wooden floor that seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. She was waiting for something, an explanation perhaps, or maybe just the satisfaction of seeing him acknowledge her words. But the mountain man had learned long ago that some accusations couldn't be answered, only endured. He kept his eyes fixed on his hands, studying the calluses and scars that told the story of his years in exile, while her presence filled the cell like smoke from a fire he couldn't escape. Sarah Morrison had never seen a man look so thoroughly defeated without being physically broken. She'd expected anger, perhaps even violence. That's what her father had warned her about when he'd reluctantly agreed to let her accompany him to the jail. Instead, she found herself staring at someone who seemed to be collapsing inward, like a house slowly surrendering to time and weather. His silence was more unsettling than any roar of protest would have been, and she found herself wishing he would at least look at her, if only to prove that he was still capable of defiance. The words she'd spoken, her father's words, really, hung in the air between them like a challenge that neither of them seemed willing to accept. She delivered them with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned the source of her certainties, but now, watching their effect, she felt the first small crack in her inherited convictions. Her father had painted the mountain man as a figure of pure menace, a cautionary tale about what happened when civilized men gave in to their baser instincts. Judge Morrison spoke of him the way preachers spoke of sin, as something dark and inevitable that good people needed to guard against. But the man sitting before her now seemed more broken than dangerous, more lost than wild. His clothes were rough but clean, his beard neatly trimmed, his hands steady despite the weight of the shackles around his wrists. She'd expected to see madness in his eyes, the kind of feral gleam that would justify her father's harsh words. Instead, she saw something that looked uncomfortably like resignation, as if he'd already accepted whatever judgment was coming and found it no worse than the one he'd been carrying all along. The stories about him had grown in the telling, the way stories always did in small towns where entertainment was scarce and imagination filled the gaps left by facts. Some said he'd killed a man with his bare hands, others that he'd burned down half of Millerville in a drunken rage. The details changed depending on who was doing the telling, but the conclusion was always the same. He was dangerous, unpredictable, a reminder of the thin line between civilization and chaos. Sarah had absorbed these stories along with her lessons in deportment and scripture, filing them away as proof of her father's wisdom and the necessity of his stern justice. But now, standing in the presence of the man himself, she found the stories harder to believe and the certainties harder to maintain. The mountain man finally raised his head, and for a moment their eyes met across the narrow space that separated them. His gaze was steady and surprisingly gentle, holding none of the wildness she'd been taught to expect. Instead, she saw something that reminded her of the old dog that used to sleep by their kitchen fire, patient, resigned, and somehow grateful for whatever small kindness might come his way. The comparison made her uncomfortable, not because it was unflattering to him, but because it suggested a capacity for suffering that her father's version of events had never acknowledged. She'd been raised to see the world in clear categories, good and evil, civilized and savage, worthy and unworthy. But this man seemed to exist in the spaces between those certainties, in a grey area that her education had never prepared her to navigate. Her father's voice echoed from the front office, discussing legal procedures with the sheriff in the measured tones of men who'd never doubted their right to decide other people's fates. Judge Morrison was a good man by all accounts, fair, honest, devoted to his family and his community. He'd built his reputation on the principle that justice required strength, that mercy without judgment was merely weakness in disguise. Sarah had never questioned these beliefs, had accepted them as naturally as she had accepted the color of her eyes or the sound of her own name. But watching the mountain man's careful stillness, she found herself wondering if strength and cruelty might sometimes wear the same face, if justice and vengeance might be harder to distinguish than she'd been taught. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was willing to cross, heavy with unspoken questions and uncomfortable truths. Sarah knew she should leave, should return to her father's side and let the machinery of justice proceed without her witness. But something kept her rooted in place. Some instinct that whispered this moment mattered in ways she couldn't yet understand. The mountain man had returned to studying his hands, but she could sense his awareness of her presence, could feel the weight of words that neither of them seemed brave enough to speak. The afternoon was dying outside the barred window, painting the cell in shades of amber and shadow that made everything seem suspended between day and night, between certainty and doubt, between the story she'd been told and the truth she was only beginning to glimpse. The morning came with the sound of her father's boots on the wooden porch, each step deliberate and heavy, like the gavel of a judge who had already decided the verdict. Sarah pressed her face against the cool glass of her bedroom window, watching as he adjusted his hat and straightened his shoulders before heading toward town, toward the jail, toward whatever business kept him away from her questions. The house settled into its familiar silence, but today that silence felt different, charged with the electricity that comes before a storm, thick with the weight of words that had been swallowed instead of spoken. She had barely slept, her mind turning over the image of the man behind those bars, the way his eyes had held something she couldn't name, something that made her chest tight and her breath shallow. Her mother moved through the kitchen like a ghost, her movements precise but distant, as if she were performing a dance she had learned long ago, but no longer remembered the music to. The coffee pot rattled against the stove, and Sarah watched her mother's hands shake slightly as she poured the dark liquid into her father's favorite cup, the one with the chip on the handle that he refused to let her throw away. "Mama," Sarah said softly, stepping into the kitchen, "tell me about the man in the jail." Her mother's back stiffened, and for a moment the only sound was the tick of the clock on the wall, counting out seconds like a heartbeat that had grown too slow. When her mother finally turned, her face was pale, her eyes holding the same haunted look that Sarah had seen in her own reflection that morning. "There are some stories, child, that are better left buried," her mother whispered, but her voice carried the tremor of someone who had been carrying a secret too heavy for her shoulders. Sarah moved closer, drawn by the pain in her mother's voice, by the way her hands clutched the coffee cup like it was an anchor in a storm she couldn't escape. "But he's just a man, isn't he? Not the monster Papa makes him out to be." The question hung in the air between them, and Sarah watched as her mother's composure cracked like ice under the weight of spring. Tears gathered in her mother's eyes, and she set the cup down with trembling fingers, the coffee sloshing over the rim and staining the wooden counter dark brown. "Your father," her mother began, then stopped, pressing her lips together as if the words were trying to escape against her will. Sarah waited, her heart pounding in her chest, sensing that whatever her mother was about to say would change everything, would shift the foundation of the world she thought she knew. "Your father is a good man, Sarah, but good men can do terrible things when they're afraid, when they're trying to protect what they love." The words came out in a rush, as if her mother had been holding them back for so long that they had built up pressure like water behind a dam. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach, a knowing that she didn't want to acknowledge, a truth that was forming at the edges of her consciousness like shadows at dusk. The sound of hoofbeats on the road made them both freeze, and her mother quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, straightening her apron and smoothing her hair, as if she could smooth away the conversation they had almost had. "Promise me, Sarah," her mother said urgently, gripping her daughter's wrist with surprising strength. "Promise me you won't go back to that jail." Some cages are meant to stay locked, not because of what's inside them, but because of what happens when people see what's been hidden. Sarah nodded, but even as she made the promise, she knew it was one she wouldn't be able to keep. The pull she felt toward the jail, toward the man with the wounded eyes, was stronger than her fear, stronger than her mother's warnings, stronger than the voice in her head that told her she was walking toward something that would change her forever. As her father's figure appeared on the horizon, riding back from town, with his shoulders set in that familiar line of rigid determination, Sarah felt the last of her childhood slip away like water through her fingers, leaving her standing in a kitchen that suddenly felt too small, too safe, too far removed from the truth that was calling to her from behind iron bars and broken dreams. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street as Sarah made her way toward the jail, each step feeling like a betrayal of the promise she had made to her mother just hours before. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders despite the heat, as if the thin fabric could somehow protect her from the weight of her own defiance. The town seemed different now. Smaller somehow, as if seeing it through new eyes had revealed how narrow its streets really were, how confining its boundaries, how suffocating its silence about the things that mattered most. She passed Mrs. Henderson hanging laundry on the line, the older woman's eyes following her with the sharp attention of someone who made it her business to know everyone else's, and Sarah forced herself to nod politely, even as her stomach churned with the knowledge of where she was heading. The jail sat at the end of the street, like a monument to all the things the town preferred not to discuss. Its adobe walls baked the color of dried blood in the relentless sun. Sarah's footsteps slowed as she approached, her courage wavering like a candle flame in the wind, but something deeper than fear drove her forward, a need to understand that had taken root in her chest and was growing with each breath she took. The deputy was nowhere to be seen, probably taking his afternoon rest in the shade behind the building, and Sarah found herself alone with the weight of her decision and the sound of her own breathing, too loud in the stillness. She approached the barred window with the careful steps of someone walking on sacred ground, knowing that whatever happened next would mark a line between who she had been and who she was becoming. "You came back," came the voice from within, and Sarah felt her knees go weak at the sound of it, rough like sandpaper but gentle, like a hand smoothing over wounded skin. She pressed closer to the bars, her fingers wrapping around the iron that was warm from the sun, and found herself looking into eyes that held depths she had never imagined possible in another human being. "I had to," she whispered, the words coming from some place inside her that she hadn't known existed until this moment. "My mother. She started to tell me something, but then she stopped, and I can't stop thinking about what she didn't say." The man moved closer to the window, and Sarah could see the details of his face now, the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the fullness of his lips that seemed at odds with the hardness the town had painted him with. "Your mother is a wise woman," he said, his voice carrying a sadness that seemed to echo from somewhere deep inside him. "Some truths are like wildfire. Once they start burning, they consume everything in their path." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from a frustration so intense it felt like drowning. "But I need to know," she said, her voice breaking on the words. "I need to understand why my father looks at you like you're something to be feared, why my mother cries when she thinks no one is watching, why this whole town pretends you don't exist, except to whisper about you in corners." The man was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face as if he were trying to read something written there in a language only he could understand. "What's your name?" he asked finally, and the question was so simple, so human, that it caught Sarah off guard. "Sarah," she whispered, and watched as something shifted in his expression. a recognition that made her breath catch in her throat. "Sarah," he repeated, and the way he said it made it sound like a prayer, like a word he had been waiting his whole life to speak. "I'm Thomas," he said, and suddenly he wasn't the mountain man anymore, wasn't the beast her father had painted him as. He was just a man with a name and a story, and eyes that held more pain than anyone should have to carry. "Thomas," she repeated, tasting the name on her tongue, feeling how it changed everything and nothing all at once. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both freeze, and Thomas stepped back from the window with the quick reflexes of someone who had learned to disappear when danger approached, leaving Sarah standing alone at the bars, with her heart pounding and the taste of his name still sweet on her lips, like honey stolen from a forbidden hive. The footsteps belonged to her father, and Sarah felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins as she turned to face the man who had shaped her understanding of right and wrong, of safety and danger, of who deserved compassion and who deserved condemnation. His face was a mask of controlled fury, the kind of anger that burned cold and steady like a forge that had been stoked for hours. And Sarah knew that whatever punishment awaited her would be measured not in harsh words, but in the slow erosion of trust that had taken 18 years to build. "Sarah Elizabeth," he said, his voice carrying the weight of disappointment that cut deeper than any shout could have, "what are you doing here?" The question hung in the air between them like a blade, and Sarah felt the last of her childhood courage crumble under the weight of his gaze, leaving her standing there with nothing but the truth and the terrible knowledge that speaking it would change everything forever. "I wanted to understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but even those 4 words felt like a declaration of war against everything her father had tried to protect her from. His jaw tightened, and she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, as if he were fighting the urge to reach for something. His gun, perhaps, or maybe just the comfort of certainty in a world that had suddenly become too complicated for simple answers. "Understand what exactly?" he asked, and Sarah heard the danger in his voice, the warning that she was approaching territory that had been marked off limits for reasons she was only beginning to comprehend. Behind her, she could feel Thomas's presence like heat from a fire, could sense him listening to every word, and the knowledge that he was there gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I want to understand why you keep him caged like an animal when he talks like a man, why Mama cries when she thinks about him, why this whole town acts like he's some kind of monster when all I see is someone who's been hurt." The words tumbled out of her in a rush, and she watched her father's face go through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, something that might have been fear, and finally a kind of resignation that made him look older than she had ever seen him. "You don't know what you're talking about, child," he said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty, and Sarah pressed her advantage like a gambler who had finally been dealt a winning hand. "Then tell me," she said, stepping closer to him, close enough to see the lines around his eyes, the grey in his beard that spoke of years spent carrying burdens she couldn't imagine. "Tell me what happened that made you so afraid of him." "Ooh." Her father was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between her face and the jail window behind her, and Sarah could see him wrestling with something, some decision that would determine the shape of all their tomorrows. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of years, thick with a pain that had been buried so deep it had fossilized into something harder than stone. "He killed your brother," he said, and the words hit Sarah like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and making the world tilt sideways around her. "Your older brother, the one you never knew about, the one your mother and I never speak of because the grief of it nearly destroyed us both." Sarah felt her knees buckle, and she reached out blindly for something to steady herself against, her hand finding the rough adobe wall of the jail as her father's words echoed in her head like thunder in a canyon. "That's not true," came Thomas's voice from behind the bars, quiet but carrying clearly in the stillness, and Sarah turned to see him pressed against the window, his face pale, but his eyes blazing with something that might have been desperation or might have been truth. "Tell her the whole story, Sheriff," Thomas said, and there was a challenge in his voice that made Sarah's father stiffen like a man preparing for battle. "Tell her about the fever, about how I carried him 20 miles through a blizzard trying to get him to a doctor, about how I held him while he died and promised him I'd watch over his little sister." The air between the three of them crackled with tension, thick with competing versions of truth, and Sarah felt herself caught in the middle of a story that was bigger than she had ever imagined, more complicated than her heart knew how to hold. Her father's hand moved to his gun, not drawing it, but resting his palm on the grip like a man seeking comfort in familiar weight. And Sarah realized with a clarity that cut through her confusion like lightning that she was standing at the center of something that had been building for years, a reckoning that had been postponed but never forgotten, a truth that demanded to be spoken even if it destroyed everything in its path.